The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, drug policy analyst Sanho Tree on why death penalties for dealers will be a colossal failure and why progressive Democrats need to care about the opioid epidemic. Plus, from seminary student to progressive activist and talk show host, Bill Press on his new memoir. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. America's war on drugs is almost 50 years old. Drug policy analyst Sanho Tree says it's been 50 years of failure that Donald Trump is only making worse. And we say hello to Sanho Tree, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and has been director of its drug policy project since 1998. Sanho Tree, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Pleasure to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. As President Trump is putting together his response to America's opioid crisis, the idea that is getting the most attention is his call for a death penalty for drug dealers. Many say it's a page out of Philippines President Duterte's playbook. How has President Duterte's crackdown on drug dealers played out in the Philippines, and has it been effective in any way in reducing drug-related crime?
Well, you know, President Duterte he shares a lot in common with Donald Trump, and they're both visceralists. They think with their guts, and they accuse people who disagree with them of fake news. And they've been dealing with the fake news problem there actually much longer than we have here in the United States. But he's pioneered a lot of the stuff that Trump is doing. And one of the things he's pioneered is the drug war, of course, where he's been killing drug users in the country. President Duterte inflated that number to 3 million. We don't know how he got that number. And then he's raised it to 4 million. And then he fired the head of the Dangerous Drug Board and says, you don't disagree with your government, without disclosing any methodology of how he arrived at that number. And then his foreign secretary this January, or last fall rather, at the UN, increased the number of users to 7 million. All the while, the death rate is skyrocketing. So as they're killing more people, they're making up numbers basically, but those numbers are going up in terms of users. So that doesn't suggest that it's working very well.
No, and if it is just them doing their own math, they're not doing a very good job of that either. Now, given that, is there any reason to think that Trump will actually be able to follow through on his threat in the United States?
I think it's very unlikely that he'll get the kinds of drug war that you see in the Philippines. In the Philippines, of course, it's mostly extrajudicial killing, death squads, and police shootouts, that sort of thing. In the United States, it would be some degree of due process, going through courts, conviction. Now, since 1994, we've already had laws on our books that allow for the death penalty in cases of drug crimes that result in murder. But what Trump wants to do and what Attorney General Sessions wants it to do is expand it to racketeering and those who smuggle large quantities of drugs, particularly large quantities. And the Supreme Court has ruled in the past that the death penalty should be reserved for crimes that result in murder, not just in crimes you disapprove of. So it's never been prosecuted. That law has been on the books since 1994, and no prosecutor has used it, probably because it wouldn't pass constitutional challenge. So we could find out under this administration if that could possibly happen or not.
Mm-hmm. Now, the death penalty proposal fits into an overall approach to drug policy that relies on punishment. In your experience, has that worked in the United States?
That has failed, and it failed miserably. The most recent study compared the rate of whether people will commit whether they'll commit drug crimes or not. You're talking about a lot of individual actors when we talk about the war on drugs. There is no, for instance, there is no international high command of the drug trade that finally says, okay, we're licked. You users stop using, growers stop growing, traffickers stop trafficking, money launderers stop what you're doing. Everyone just surrender now. We're defeated. Let's give up. That will never happen. And so when we talk about the millions of individuals around the world that have entered the drug economy, they do so because they think they'll get away with it, and by and large, most of them do. And so for them, it's an individual calculation. Can I gain this little segment of the drug trafficking chain successfully to make a lot of money, knowing very well that most people are not caught? And so it doesn't, they cannot be coerced into surrender. There is no high command of the drug war, of the drug trade, that will organize and implement a coherent, structured surrender of enemy forces. This is not like using coercion against a nation state, where nation A uses its military against nation B to get it to bend to its will or to surrender. We have literally been waging a war for decades against an enemy who is quite literally incapable of surrender, of organized surrender. This is by definition a forever war. And in fact, what our drug war does is incentivize people who are already engaged in the drug trade, and it attracts more people. And the way that works is that our policymakers, our drug warriors, have developed a modern alchemy. Because when we're talking about things like marijuana, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, it's important to remember these are minimally processed agricultural and chemical commodities that cost pennies per dose to produce in the real world. It is our policy of prohibition that makes these things so astronomically more valuable, to the point where people are willing to kill or die over them. And the way we build that value into this smuggling chain is by adding risk. That's one of the main ways that we do this. And so as each segment of the smuggling chain gets riskier, the more law enforcement we apply in these areas, then the higher the risk premium that individual trafficker can charge the next person down the smuggling chain. So each time this commodity changes hands, it increases in value because of the added risks involved. And when it crosses a particularly well-guarded or dangerous border, like the U.S.-Mexico border, then it gets an even higher risk premium attached to it. And so that incentivizes, you never make these substances disappear by making them astronomically more valuable, which is what we have done with the drug war. Think of counter-narcotics policy as a price support, if you will, to drug traffickers. So we're rewarding them. At the same time, we're also applying law enforcement in a very ill-conceived and blanket manner. Get them all, especially low-hanging fruit. And what that does year over year is it creates a rapid Darwinian evolution of the drug trade, so that the people we typically capture tend to be the people who are dumb enough to get caught, basically. No offense if any of your audience members have been caught for anything, but the slang on the street is the dealer who uses loses, right? You get careless, you get sloppy, you get apprehended. Conversely, the people we tend to miss as we do this decade after decade are the people who are the most innovative, the most cunning, the most adaptable, the most intelligent, the most efficient. Right, so we've had this process of artificial selection, if you will. We've been selectively breeding super traffickers. And we can't hope to win a war on drugs when our policies ensure that only the most efficient operations survive. And not only do they survive, but they thrive because we've, again, done two things indirectly to help them. Number one, we've picked off their inefficient competition for them. We got rid of the clumsy traffickers and opened up this lucrative trafficking space to the efficient traffickers. And number two, we try to constrict the supply of drugs on the street while the demand remains the same or even increases, thereby driving up their prices and their profits. That's why the drug war is doomed to fail.
We're speaking with Sanho Tree, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, and he's been the director of its drug policy project since 1998. Another tool in Trump's arsenal in the war on drugs is the wall. He claims it could halt the flow of narcotics into our country. Is there any reason at all to think a wall would do that?
No. In fact, it could make the situation far worse if in the unlikely event this wall actually stops, let's say, 30% or magically 50% of the heroin. It's very counterintuitive. You would think that would be a good thing. But in fact, it could set up the scenario for absolute disaster. And here's why. What's killing people today is not so much heroin, it's the fentanyl that's being used to adulterate the heroin on the streets. And so fentanyl is about 50 times more potent than heroin. And if by some miracle we're able to stop the fentanyl as well, there's carfentanil, a different analog of fentanyl that's about 1,000 times or 10,000 times more powerful than morphine. So these are very compact and very powerful synthetic opioids that are made in laboratories that are mostly underground in China and elsewhere. They're easy to smuggle through the postal system or across the borders. It's far more compact than heroin. And so if we magically are able to stop, let's say, 50% of the heroin somehow, then there is a predictable market response. Dealers will then will smuggle more fentanyl and carfentanil and other synthetic opioids in order to adulterate the remaining supplies of heroin to maximize their profits. And so if that happens, you will see the overdose rate in this country skyrocket, and people will literally start dropping like flies. We're already seeing carfentanil turn up in our domestic heroin supply on the streets. It was never designed for human use, whereas fentanyl does have some hospital uses, medical use. But carfentanil is basically elephant tranquilizer, buffalo tranquilizer. And a few grains is lethal. So it's very difficult to blend that stuff into the heroin supply in any kind of predictable or safe manner, and that's why people are dying.
You've written that the overall framing of this issue as a quote-unquote war on drugs is problematic and doomed to fail. Expand on that, if you would, please.
No, there's the iron law of prohibition, right, which says that if you try to stop a particular drug, people will fall. But we also should have learned that lesson through alcohol prohibition, which helped transform a nation of beer drinkers and wine drinkers into a nation of hard liquor drinkers, right? If you were a bootlegger during alcohol prohibition, for instance, the last thing you wanted to smuggle was beer, right? If you're going to take the risk of going to jail, you don't want to haul this giant keg of beer on your back where you'll be spotted and captured. You wanted instead to smuggle the most potent form of alcohol available, moonshine or grain alcohol, in order to maximize your profits. By the same token, it makes no sense for international cartels to smuggle 50% pure heroin. They want the maximum purity of heroin if they're going to take the risk to cross those borders. They want the biggest payoff. In other ways, for instance, our war on marijuana in the 1980s, so this is when Ronald Reagan declared it to be public enemy number one, and brought in the military into South Florida and Coast Guard into the Caribbean to try to cut off the shipments of marijuana from Colombia and Jamaica. And it didn't take long for the Colombian smugglers to realize, look, we got something else here that's a lot more compact, it's more potent, it's addictive to a lot of people, and the dogs don't know how to sniff for it yet, and it's easily smuggleable to smuggle in these large shipping containers or nooks and crannies, and that, of course, was cocaine. So in some ways, our war on marijuana in the 80s helped popularize the cocaine explosion of the 80s. Still other ways, our war on cocaine helped popularize the poor person's cocaine, crack. And in still other ways, in many ways, our war on crack helped repopularize the poor person's crack, methamphetamines. So each time you end up with a more potent, more difficult stop, easier to produce, more problematic substance.
Wow. We just keep growing the problem bigger and bigger as we try and correct it. Moving toward what would work, a place to begin is how we understand our current opioid crisis. You believe it begins with understanding the demand over the supply. In other words, why do people choose drugs? What are the types of questions we should be asking to understand this?
Yeah, so if I were to testify in front of Congress, for instance, and I could hypothetically lay out a dozen syringes in front of the committee and say, okay, here's a dozen syringes of heroin. How many of you would want to inject? And my guess is probably zero. And we have to ask, why is that the case? And why do other people choose to use it? And a lot of it it's very complex. The saying in this field that if you know one person with addiction, you've known exactly one person with addiction. Everyone has different drivers and causes what's going on in their lives. It can have a lot to do with issues that are rooted in poverty, which is the easy one to point to. But despair and alienation also cut across class lines in very profound and interesting ways. And so it's a confluence of things for different people. It could be a history of sexual abuse as a youth. There's a very high correlation between later addiction in life and childhood abuse. There could be PTSD issues. There could be, despair. There's a whole field of study called diseases of despair or deaths of despair. A lot has been written about this confluence of overlap of areas of the country, particularly rural areas where Trump did well and where the opioid crisis is hitting very hard. And I think it's gotten a little too much play in recent months. And we've forgotten that the opioid crisis is killing people of color, particularly African Americans in our urban areas, as just as high, if not higher rate. So we have to look at why people choose to self-medicate at such relatively high levels compared to other industrialized economies that have much more liberal drug laws and yet lower rates of problematic drug use and abuse. I think in many ways it's a disease of modernity. That's a far deeper conversation to have another time. But I think we've never evolved life ways that sustain our culture for multiple generations. We keep inventing this new world every generation. And we haven't invented the life ways, traditions, the things that stabilize the culture. And so we're kind of making it up as we go along these days.
And so let's go from understanding to actual policy. What are some of the policies that you'd like to see to address America's problem with drug addiction?
Yeah, so I think, how do you get politicians to actually move on this issue, I think is the most important question for me. And this comes after having, talked to 300 or 400 congressional staffers and members of Congress over the years about different facets of drug policy. Privately, they'll tell you that the drug war has failed, and this is Democrats and conservatives as well as liberals. Anyway, so it's across the partisan spectrum. Privately, they'll admit that, and then publicly, they tend to vote in favor of these drug war policies. And I think that has to do with our electoral system and the way we campaign in this country, that the solutions to this drug problem are very often counterintuitive. That's to say, the knee-jerk, tough reaction. Trump keeps using the word tough almost in every other sentence he talks about this issue. But being tough is not the same as being effective. And in fact, it can produce the opposite effect, as I've mentioned earlier. And so how do you get politicians to admit in public what they believe in private? And I think that's one of the things we need to look at. There are different mechanisms for doing that. One way I found is that if you took a blind, non-binding straw poll of elected officials or organizations or conferences and asked them, with a veil of anonymity, how they feel about, let's say, legalizing marijuana, tax and regulate marijuana, as so many 9 states and D.C. have done. Would you support that or not? And if you ask that in the open in Congress, for instance, you might get maybe, 24 members of Congress raising their hands saying they would support that. A decade ago, it might have been 2 or 3 members of Congress. 20 years ago, it might have been 1 member of Congress. But if you ask that same question today in Congress and the House of Representatives and treated them like children and say, okay, for the next 15 minutes, put your heads down on your desks, no one peek, now raise your hand if you believe in supporting this kind of policy. So if you give them a mask, they will very often tell you the truth. I'm not suggesting that we should make laws in secret. These are non-binding procedural exercises, but it is a way to break a false consensus so that things can emerge to the surface that would otherwise take a long time to percolate. Things like gun control, like climate change, like Israel policy or raising taxes, things that politicians understand have to be done but are afraid to say so for fear of negative attack ads. As the Prime Minister of Luxembourg said about a different controversial or third-rail issue at home, he said, look, we all know what needs to be done. We just don't know how to get reelected after we've done it. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think the best way to frame that, again, comes from one of my favorite popular philosophers. You've probably heard of him, last name Simpson, first name Bartholomew. But there's an episode of The Simpsons early on where young Bart runs for class president. And he begins his campaign by attacking his opponent. in a negative speech, and he says, "My opponent says there are no easy answers. Well, I say he's not looking hard enough." That's the problem we have in Washington. Right? That's why Fox News is popular. That's why Congress is paralyzed, that they think voters only understand versus the knee-jerk answer.
There's a lot to learn from young Bartholomew.
Yeah. But there are lots of basic things that could be done right now that Trump is not considering at all. There could be supervised injection facilities that are popping up all over Canada. That's been in Vancouver for many years now. Lots of other cities around the world have them, and there has been no fatal overdoses of anyone who's used a supervised injection facility. San Francisco, Seattle, and Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, rather, are thinking of implementing those things on their own, but they're illegal under federal law. But there's also things like prescription opioid maintenance doses. So Canada is thinking of doing this. And other countries have done this historically as well. It began in the UK. Switzerland does this. Prescription heroin. That sounds crazy. Why would the government give anyone who's addicted free heroin? Well, it's counterintuitive, but if you believe that saving a life is the most important thing, it makes no sense to take people who are highly dependent on these drugs and to cut them off suddenly and force them into the black market, where they're basically playing Russian roulette with the street heroin scene. They think these other governments are saying, look, we'd rather you didn't do these things, but if you're going to do it, if you're hell bent on going out of there and using heroin, then we'd rather you got prescription heroin, which is pharmaceutically pure, it's of a known dosage and purity, and it's not enough to keep you getting higher and higher and chasing the dragon, as they say on the streets, but it's a maintenance dose that will keep you from going into withdrawal, which is what most people are afraid of. And so it's a very counterintuitive but sensible way to keep lots more people alive in the short run. But there are everything from needle exchange facilities to supervised consumption rooms to all these other harm reduction elements the Trump administration isn't even considering. They just want to build a wall and execute people.
Unbelievable. Sanho Tree, fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, the director of its drug policy project since 1998, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Sanho, thank you so much for your time with us today. We do look forward to having you. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical...
Truman and Kennedy and others who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, a conversation with Bill Press on his life and the making of one of America's leading voices for progressive politics. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Some are born with good luck, but I was 30 years old before Lady Luck smiled on me with full radiance, arriving in the form of a petite bundle of feistiness, smarts, political savviness, warmth, playfulness, and all-around beauty, named Susan DeMarco. I apologize for turning inward for a personal commentary today, but DeMarco, as she's called by all who've known her, is an admirable example of the virtue of citizen activism, unsung heroes and heroines standing up for the common good. She's been a teacher, leader of public interest groups, investigative journalist, author of 3 books, government official, public policy innovator, mentor, and lifelong champion of economic fairness, social justice, and equal opportunity for all. In other words, as one activist put it, she's a firecracker. Alas, though, on the 1st of April, DeMarco slipped away from me and all who loved her. I was alone with her when she drew her last breath, 18 hours after I asked the hospital to honor her previously written directive that all life support tubes be removed from her body. Crushingly sad, of course, yet deeply rewarding, for she not only outmaneuvered the blood clot that had slammed into her brain, but also our society's high-tech medical imperative that she be held captive in her own severely damaged body. And how very DeMarco that she managed to fly away on the 1st, which ironically was both Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day. This is Jim Hightower saying, above all, DeMarco was a free spirit, full of life, curiosity, and imagination. For example, she delighted in the diversity of birds that populated her big South Austin yard, and she often had magical dreams of flying with them. She even imagined just what she did.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. As listeners to this program, you're very familiar with the voice of Bill Press, host of The Bill Press Show. We carry, of course, segments from the program each week in this podcast. Now's your chance to get to know Bill Press a little better. He has just published a memoir. It's called From the Left, A Life in the Crossfire, and Bill Press joins us now on americasdemocrats.org. Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for all that you do.
Absolutely. Your story begins in a small town called Delaware City, where life for you was dominated, among other things, by a very Catholic upbringing, a big extended family, helping out at your father's garage, and even a few school musicals tossed in. What are some of the things from those years that influenced you later in your life in politics and media?
Well, first of all, I have to say my faith upbringing, my family is a strict Catholic family, very much a part of the church, was very much a part of our lives. Church every Sunday. I was an altar boy, and the parish priest was kind of a rock star in the community. Everybody respected him. And that certainly impressed me, in fact, so much that I went on to Catholic high school, and then after Catholic high school, I studied for the priesthood for 9 or 10 years. But what stuck with me, I think, is a sense of values that remained with me in my political life and in my media life, remain with me today. I don't wear my religion on my sleeve, but I know there's a kind of a code of conduct, again, a sense of moral values that I carry with me, and I feel that that's very important, a very important part of my life. 1, 2, something else happened when I was living in that little town in Delaware City, and that was they built a great big, huge. We lived in a very idyllic, bucolic setting. Surrounded by marshland and peach orchards right on the banks of the Delaware River. And just 2 miles outside of town, when I was in high school, they destroyed that countryside and built the largest refinery to that point on the east coast of the United States. And watching the loss of that beautiful countryside where we used to hunt and fish and just enjoy the natural beauty of it, really did impact me, and I know drove me to become a pretty passionate environmentalist for the rest of my life. 2, and then 3 is one thing about Delaware City. It was a great little place to grow up. I really realized later, if you were white, but this was a segregated town at the time, and eventually I just came to realize that this was a wrong way of life, a wrong way to go. And I'm ashamed looking back, but it was a time when there were white churches and white stores and black stores and white schools and black schools, and it was just the way we grew up and didn't think about it at the time. But it was just so wrong, and I'm glad to have left that behind me.
Mm-hmm. It is pretty amazing, and it wasn't that long ago either, which is pretty incredible. Now, you eventually left Delaware City, not to go to college, but as you mentioned, to enter the priesthood. And while you never actually became a priest, you encountered some powerful ideas that had a big impact on you. Among them was the worker priest movement, which was so powerful to you that it actually ended your religious career. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I was, in the Catholic, in seminaries. There are different kinds of seminaries. There are what are called diocesan priests who work in parishes and take care of communities that way. And then there are other orders that have a special mission, like hospitals or missions in Africa. I was a part of an order, a religious order. Their work was teaching high school. And so I knew that when I went in. I thought high school was part of my training for 2 years. But then I was sent to Europe to study, and I became familiar with the worker priest movement. This was in France, and it was very, very exciting. And priests were living not in a church, a parish church, or they weren't living in a Catholic high school. They were living out in the community. They were in an apartment, and they were working in factories, and they were working also my life. And I went to my superior general at the time, very much like in the Army, and said, okay, I've signed up and I'll stay, but I don't want to teach high school. This is what I want to do. And I was told, you got to make a choice. We are a teaching order. It's either, it's all or nothing. So I took a year off to think about it. I went to San Francisco, happened to be the summer of love, the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement, which I became very much a part of, and I never looked back and never went back.
And that kind of leads me into the next question. You went to California, you studied theology at Berkeley, got your first real taste of politics as a volunteer for Eugene McCarthy in '68. Did you realize then you were where you wanted to be?
Well, yes and no. That was my introduction to politics. And it was interesting because, quick story, but I was very, very lucky when I was a junior in high school. I had an opportunity to interview John F. Kennedy. He was a senator. He had just run for vice president at the National Convention the year before and lost. So he's still a senator, not yet the candidate for president. I interviewed him, and as a junior in high school, one of the things I asked him was, if you really want to get involved in politics, you're like me, just a kid, how do you do it? And he said, the way to do it is, the best way to do it is walk into a campaign find somebody you like, walk into their campaign headquarters and volunteer. Flash forward. As your question, I'm in San Francisco, I'm teaching high school, I'm very much against the war, and here's this senator who stands up and dares challenge, where nobody else would, dares challenge Lyndon B. Johnson over the Vietnam War. And Gene McCarthy happened to be also a former seminarian. I really identified with him, but I still didn't do anything until Gene McCarthy, in effect, won the New Hampshire primary. He came in second, but he came in so strong that everybody said, oh my God, Lyndon Johnson is vulnerable on this issue. And that very next day, after Gene McCarthy proved that, Bobby Kennedy jumped into the race. And I was so pissed off that Bobby Kennedy was jumping in to take Gene McCarthy's fire away from him, that the next day, politics was how you could really make a difference. You could really bring about change. And if I could get a paid job in politics, I would quit my teaching job. And that's what I did.
I tell you, that's a heck of a message for the movements that we're seeing today. I think that really would resonate well, and I think we're starting to see that. It's just kind of occurring with some of the young folks out there and the protests that we've seen recently. So moving along kind of in a chronological way, after that there were numerous...
Just a footnote on that is absolutely amen. I was at the March for Our Lives here in Washington, D.C., and it was so powerful. And one of the things that made it so powerful is that this was not organized, this was not led by the tired same tired old self-serving politicians. These are the young people of America, and I've never heard more powerful speakers or heard a more powerful message than we heard at that March for Our Lives.
It was very different from anything we've seen in many, many years. That's for sure. So numerous political jobs, including one with Peter Baer in 1970 for you. You called it the best campaign you've ever been a part of. What made it so different?
What made Peter Baer was a Republican. He was a strong environmentalist. Before we even had the word environmentalist, he was a strong conservationist at the time. He had been the leader of a movement to create the Great Point Reyes National Seashore, which still exists there in Marin County, north of San Francisco. I met him, hooked up with him, and he was, first of all, he was such a great candidate. He was way ahead of his time. Actually, this was 1970. He had his car converted from running on gasoline to running on propane. He was the first alternative fuel guy, I think, maybe in California. And he was very smart. He was very outgoing. People loved him. He loved people. He was a fun candidate to be around. And then he had a movement of all these volunteers that had helped him create the seashore, who jumped into the campaign, his campaign for state senate, which I was lucky enough then to become the campaign manager of. And most of them were working for somebody who was one of the leading and most outspoken environmentalists in the state of California.
And I love the fact that there he is with a gas-free car back then. I mean, that's phenomenal.
He had a sign made that he put on top of the car. Propane-driven car. It was a Chevy Camaro. I remember. We won the campaign, won the election, and then Peter invited me to come to Sacramento as his chief of staff. At the time, Sacramento was considered, and some people still consider it, kind of a big cow town. We could stand it for a year or two, but I got the taste of working in the state legislature, working in the Capitol, working with him to get environmental bills passed, to actually becoming the head of a statewide environmental organization called the Planning and Conservation League. And I was their lobbyist then, lobbying members of the legislature for environmental legislation. For 2 years, Jerry Brown gets elected governor, and Jerry reached out to me, and I became his policy director and one of his chief environmental advisors. And our big accomplishment at that time was saving the California coast. There was an initiative campaign and then legislation, which on behalf of Jerry Brown, I kind of coordinated the passage of to save the entire California coastline. And that's still, that protection remains today. And it's one of the great, I think, environmental victories of any state.
We're speaking with Bill Press, of course, host of The Bill Press Show, and he has just published a memoir, which we're touching on here today. It's called From the Left, A Life in the Crossfire. So you became the executive director of an environmental lobby and then eventually joined that staff of Governor Jerry Brown. And you called those years exhilarating, challenging, frustrating, and an incredible experience. It's probably pretty hard to sum up simply, but give us a better sense of what it was like to work for Jerry Brown.
Well, I'll say this. It was working for, and we knew it at the time, it was working for the most exciting, the smartest, the most colorful, the most visionary, the most popular, the most attractive politician in the entire country. He was 34 years old when he was elected. I was a couple of years younger, and Jerry was on the forefront of so many issues, whether it was on the energy side, moving away from the big push to nuclear power at the time, and Jerry already into alternative sources of energy, on the environmental side, the criminal justice side, the economic side. I mean, he really was so far ahead of his time on so many issues. And so, like, we were like it was like on the policy cutting edge of America, and Jerry got attracted so much attention, both national and globally, that everybody would come to Sacramento to meet and hang out with Jerry Brown. I mean, Mother Teresa comes to Sacramento to meet Jerry Brown. Cesar Chavez was often in the governor's office, and I got to know him pretty well. And so, surrounded by these people and working for this incredible intellect at the time was very, very exciting.
You know, when Mother Teresa shows up to hang out, I think at that point you've made it.
At that time, you say something's going on.
Yeah, right. And you better enjoy it while you have it. Journalism was next for you, and eventually, of course, you landed a few of your better-known gigs opposite Tucker Carlson on CNN's Spin Room and as the liberal pundit on CNN's Crossfire, where you describe one of your favorite moments as the joint appearance of Jerry Falwell and a San Francisco prostitute. After spending your days working with people of distinctly different political views, what did you learn about how we can talk across our ideological divides?
Well, that was a very important lesson that I learned at the time. And I had been doing political commentary. I was very lucky. I got my first job in television at the #1 station in California, the #2 station in the country, KABC in LA, and I was there for 9 years and then moved to a competing channel, Channel 13, KCOP. But then I got my big break when Crossfire was hiring a co-host on the left to replace Michael Kinsley. I got myself in the mix. I ended up getting the job. So here I am on national television, and I'm up against Bob Novak, right? There was no more outspoken, bigger conservative name at the time than Bob Novak, and Pat Buchanan, who had run for president twice. In fact, when I got there, he was running for the second time, and he was not even, he was on a leave, and so John Sununu, who became governor of New Hampshire, was a co-host. Mary Madeline, then Tucker Carlson moved in. And what I really learned is that you can be as passionate as I am about the issues, and debate them from the fullness of your heart and brain, with people who are totally on the other side of that issue, and yet still have respect for them and even be friends with them. And people could not believe that those of us on Crossfire, when the lights went out, when the show was over, that we would actually go out to dinner together. Not every night, but we did. I socialized together, have a beer together. Bob Novak had a house at the beach. We'd go over there and go to the beach with Bob and his wife, because John Sununu summed it up best. I thought one time when he said, "Look, life is too short, and this show is too short to take it all personally." So we didn't abandon our principles at all. We fought like hell for what we believed in, but again, we communicated and we reached out and we respected the other side. And boy, that is what was sort of marked debate in Washington D.C. at the time. And it is sad that it no longer exists. Now it is the two warring camps, and they never reach across the aisle.
Mm-hmm. Now, talking a little bit about political office, you've run for political office not once but twice, lost both times. Given how grueling it can be to run for office, what attracted you to try?
Well, I would hope that it was at least twofold. I mean, there's no doubt that part of it is the ego satisfaction. I think people, I joke sometimes that people study for the priesthood the same reason they enter politics, or go into the priesthood the same reason they enter politics, because they're automatically, by virtue of the office, put up on a pedestal. People look up to them. People respect them. They're kind of a big deal, right? So there's the ego side of it. But the other side of it is, I really do think that it's a very, very important form of public service, and I have great respect and admiration for people who put themselves out there, because it's tough to run for office. not just the time that it takes, the lack of the privacy that you give up that way, the number of time under our present system, amount of time under our present system you have to spend raising money. But for me, it was always a form of a public service, of what I might do to make California a better place, which is why I took a little bit of time to try to put together a campaign for the U.S. Senate and dropped out of that, and then did run statewide for the first time that the Office of State Insurance Commissioner was a statewide office. And there, for example, I believe that the Insurance Commissioner's office could be the number one consumer affairs department, really the pro-consumer arm of the California government. That's what I wanted to make that office, and that's why I ran for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, needless to say, we have jumped over huge parts of your story today, Bill, and more than a little international intrigue. It would take all day to tell that whole story, or folks can go and read the book. Perhaps that's, it's called From the Left, A Life in the Crossfire. But here you are now, and having been an active participant in so many pivotal political moments in your nation's history, what insight does your life give you on this unique time?
Well, I'll tell you what, and let's tie it together to what we first talked about with the March for Our Lives over the weekend. I see right now, I think this is a very, very important time. I do think this is a turning point. I think this new generation, this generation that's coming into power now and coming into voting age right now, I have not seen that kind of energy. I don't think we've ever seen that kind of energy and passion and commitment and determination. Certainly, in my own life, not since the anti-war protest of the 60s, and this may be even greater than that. And so what I find so heartening today is that so many young people are stepping up, running for, getting involved in politics, getting involved in not necessarily partisan politics, getting involved in important issues like gun safety, like climate change. They are getting involved in these organizations like Indivisible and Our Revolution and Emily's List and ACLU and Run for Something, all these great organizations that are popping up. This is a grassroots explosion right now, a revolution led from the grassroots. And a lot of them more and more are running for office. And look what happened in Virginia. They had a Democrat running in every single district in Virginia, and they won 15 seats. Look what happened with Connor Lamb up in Pennsylvania's 18th. Emily's List is training 21,000 women across the country this year, an unheard of number, running for school board and city council and state legislature and on up. So I think this is a very, very exciting time, and I find it very, very exciting, very refreshing.
Watching all the different cuts from the march, marches around the country and around the world. Actually, I mean, it's something we probably haven't felt in this country, as you point out.
Safety issue, but maybe nothing happened after Sandy Hook or after the Pulse nightclub or after Las Vegas or after...
It's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible, Sanho Tree and Bill Press. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.